He thought all he had left were dying trees and one last bushel of apples. She showed up barefoot, lost, and asking for directions. He handed her 2 apples without a price. She left without a name. Weeks later, a lawyer arrived with a deed, and the orchard wasn't his burden anymore. It was his future. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The apples came in sparse that year, fewer than any season before. Most clung to the branches like they didn't want to be picked, misshapen and streaked with sunburn, their skins tougher than usual. Caleb ran his hand over the bark of the old Macintosh tree, fingers tracing the cracked ridges like a prayer. He remembered planting it with his father, one spring long ago when the air still smelled like promise, and the orchard was something more than memory. Now the soil was dry, compacted by too many years of wind and silence. Rain hadn't touched it in weeks. The leaves hung limp, faded at the edges, like they'd given up early. He moved through the rows with a half-empty basket slung at his hip, the canvas strap worn from a decade of patchwork repairs. Each apple he picked landed with a dull thud, not the crisp snap they once gave. He worked slow, methodical, not because he was tired, though he was, but because there wasn't any hurry. Nothing to rush toward anymore. At the edge of the orchard, just past the last row of trees, the for sale sign leaned slightly to the left, one of the bolts stripped from when the wind had knocked it over last week. He'd hammered it back in, but it wouldn't stay straight. Neither would he. The barn loomed behind him, one side caved in from last winter's snow, its roof sagging like a chest too weak to hold breath. Inside, the sorting table was covered in dust and mouse droppings. The crates, stacked in uneven towers, no one would fill. Caleb hadn't bothered with labels this year. No one was buying. He wiped his brow, sweat streaking through the dust like a wound. The bank had called again that morning. 2 months, they said. He didn't argue. Just hung up, then stood for a long time in the kitchen, staring at the stove like he could will it into cooking a future that wasn't slipping away. He could still hear his mother's voice there sometimes, telling him not to waste food, not to forget where he came from. He hadn't forgotten. That was the problem. By dusk, the basket was barely half full. He set it down by the fence and looked out over the orchard, now just a patchwork of brittle branches and shadows. A storm brewed somewhere beyond the hills, but it would pass them by again. It always did. The bank smelled like lemon-scented floor polish and paper that hadn't been touched in years. Caleb stood at the counter with his hat in his hands, fingers tightening around the brim like it was the only thing keeping him tethered. The lobby was empty except for the tick of the wall clock and a fake fern wilting in its plastic pot near the entrance. He recognized the woman behind the glass, Judy, or maybe Janine. Her hair was grayer now, cut shorter than he remembered, but she still wore that same tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. She glanced at the screen, tapped a few keys, and let out a sigh that said more than any words. "You're behind," she said, like he didn't already know. 3 months on the note, and the grace period's gone. "I've been trying," Caleb said. His voice felt too loud in the silence. "I've got a harvest coming in. Smaller than usual, but it'll sell. Maybe enough to cover some." She didn't look up. "The orchard was appraised last year. It's losing value, Caleb. The market's shifting. Folks want development, not dirt and old trees." "I'm not selling to developers," he said flatly. She finally met his eyes then. "I'm not telling you to, but the bank doesn't care who buys it, just that someone does. You've got 60 days. After that, it moves to default." She pushed a sheet of paper across the counter, the terms typed in neat rows like they were reasonable. Her nails tapped once, soft but final. He stared at the paper. The words bled together. Principal, interest, liquidation. They all felt like weapons, sharp and impersonal. "There's nothing else?" he asked, though he already knew. She softened, but only just. "Unless you've got collateral you haven't told us about, no. No more extensions. I'm sorry." Caleb nodded once, slowly, like he was swallowing gravel. He folded the paper, tucked it into his back pocket, and walked out without another word. Outside, the sun was too bright, glaring off the windshield of his truck. He sat behind the wheel, gripping it with both hands, the sweat on his neck going cold. 60 days. That was all the land had left before it stopped being his. The apples wouldn't be enough, not this year. He turned the key, and the engine sputtered awake like it didn't want to go either. The road back to the orchard stretched long and silent, lined with fields he couldn't save. The orchard looked different at dusk, softer somehow, but lonelier too. The kind of quiet that didn't just settle, it sank. Caleb moved between the rows like a man walking through memory more than land. The trees cast long shadows in the amber light, their limbs stretched like tired arms, bark flaking in places where years had worn deep. Some still bore fruit, clinging in stubborn clusters, but most were bare, tired, like him. His boots crunched on fallen leaves, brittle and curling at the edges. He stopped at the old wine sap near the south fence, the one his father had called the strong one. Caleb reached out and pressed his hand to its trunk. The bark was rough, cold from the coming night, and it didn't give beneath his palm. He remembered being small enough to wrap both arms around that tree, trying to climb it with too short legs and too much gumption. His father had laughed that day, a deep, easy sound that shook through the orchard like wind through the branches. Now there was no laughter, not any more. He kept walking, the air thick with the scent of overripe fruit and dry earth. The sun slipped lower, painting the rows in rust and gold, catching the glint of wire fencing that hadn't been mended in seasons. He passed the stump of a tree they'd cut down when the rot had gone too deep to save it. It still looked like a scar, a reminder that not everything could be healed. Sometimes he swore he could hear his father's voice out here, low, steady, always teaching something. How to prune the limbs without cutting too deep, how to spot leaf blight before it spread, how to let go of the ones that wouldn't come back. Caleb never listened well to that last part. He stopped near the creek bed where the trees thinned and the land dipped just enough to let the wind through. That's where he heard it, a sound too faint to be real, too familiar not to be. A child's laugh, echoing, faint, and gone. He stood still, breath caught in his throat, listening hard. But there was only wind now and the creak of branches above, ghosts in the trees, or maybe just memories too heavy to bury. He turned back, walking slower than before, like maybe, just maybe, something out there had walked with him. The sound of tires on gravel wasn't common out here. Caleb paused mid-swing, the hammer still in his hand, sweat beading under his collar as he turned toward the road. The orchard fence ran long and crooked, split-rail wood silvered by age, and just past it, dust hung in the air like smoke. A sedan, tan, low to the ground, too clean for this side of the county, sat idling near the north entrance, its front end angled like it had taken a wrong turn and kept going. He watched for a beat, shoulders tense, heart thudding with that quiet alarm country people get when the unexpected shows up uninvited. Then the door opened. She stepped out barefoot, her heels tucked under one arm like they'd failed her one too many times. Her jeans were rolled up uneven at the ankles, one cuff dragging in the dirt. Wind caught her hair, pulling it across her face as she shaded her eyes with the flat of her hand, blinking hard toward the orchard. "Sorry," she called, her voice unsteady but clear. "I think I'm lost." Caleb said nothing at first, just stared. There was something not right about her, something off in the way she stood too still, like someone holding their breath. She wasn't hurt, but she looked untethered, like she'd run out of road without realizing it. She stepped closer to the fence, wincing slightly at the gravel under her feet. "Is there a gas station, or a main road, somewhere nearby?" Her voice cracked at the edges, not dramatic, just brittle, like she'd been driving with too much on her mind and nowhere to put it. Caleb cleared his throat. Town's 10 miles back the way you came. Nearest gas is 15. You won't make it with that tire, he added, nodding toward the back wheel, visibly low. She turned to look, swore under her breath, then looked back at him like she wasn't sure whether to apologize again or ask for more. Can I... She paused, then tried again. Would it be all right if I parked here a bit? Just need to figure out what's next. He studied her. Dust on her clothes, sweat at her temple, a small tremor in her hands she was trying hard to hide. This wasn't a tourist. This wasn't someone just passing through. This was someone who had stopped running and only just realized it. He gave a single nod. No words, just enough. She exhaled, relief or disappointment, he couldn't tell, and turned back toward the car. The sedan quieted. The dust settled. And something in the orchard held its breath. He wasn't sure why he walked back into the orchard. The woman hadn't asked for anything, not food, not help, not even his name, just parked her car at the edge of his land and sat behind the wheel like the whole world might collapse if she moved again. Still, something about the way she'd stood there barefoot, trying to keep her voice steady, stayed with him longer than it should have. So he went to the winesap tree. The one that always gave a little sweeter, held its fruit just a little longer than the rest. The drought had been cruel this season, but a few apples still clung to the branches, red streaked with gold, sun-warmed and quiet. He reached up, tugged 2 down, and wiped the dust off one with the hem of his shirt. They weren't perfect. A bruise here, a blemish there, but they were honest. When he walked back toward the fence, she was sitting on the hood of her car, arms folded across her knees, eyes on the horizon like she was trying to will a different answer out of the sky. Her shoes sat untouched in the dirt. The wind lifted her hair in slow strands, but she didn't brush it away. He held out the apples without a word. She blinked up at him, caught off guard. Her mouth opened slightly like she might protest, say she didn't need them, didn't want charity, but the words never came. They're better cold, he said, voice low, but they'll do. She hesitated, then reached out and took them both, her fingers brushing his for a second longer than necessary. Not intentional, just enough. I don't have any cash, she said finally, eyes meeting his now. Didn't ask for any, he replied. Her gaze didn't waver. There was something there, something sharp-edged and raw, but soft beneath, like someone who had learned to flinch before kindness and didn't know what to do when it came quiet. She looked at the apples in her lap, then back at him. Thank you. He nodded once and turned before the moment stretched too long. As he walked back toward the trees, he felt it in his chest, that strange pull, not need, not yet, just a flicker, like someone had seen him for the first time in a long while and hadn't looked away. She stood there for a moment longer than he expected, apple in hand, like she was waiting for some invisible door to open. Her thumb ran slow over the smooth skin, brushing a bruise near the stem. Then, without a word, she lifted it to her mouth and took a bite. The crunch echoed in the quiet like something final. Juice ran down her wrist, and she didn't bother to wipe it, just closed her eyes for a second, held still, and let it settle. When she opened them again, she looked lighter somehow, not happy, not fixed, just less breakable. The way someone looks when a tiny piece of them remembers they're still here. Thank you, she said again, quieter this time, not just for the apples, not just for the moment, something else. He gave a short nod, the brim of his hat hiding his eyes. Then she turned and walked slowly back to the car. The hem of her jeans caught on the gravel, her bare feet brushing dry weeds that bent but didn't break. Her spine was straight, but the kind of straight that's holding too much. She moved like someone who'd gotten used to leaving before she was ready. The driver's door groaned when she pulled it open. She tossed the other apple onto the passenger seat, then slid behind the wheel. The engine stuttered once before catching. A low idle, rough at first. Her hands gripped the wheel like she wasn't sure if she'd actually drive or just sit there, until the orchard swallowed her whole. Then, like wind, she was moving. The tires kicked up a slow cloud of dust, and the car eased back toward the road without fanfare. No wave, no glance back, just the hum of departure. She didn't even put her shoes on. Caleb watched the dust trail lift behind her, catching light in the late sun. Watched until it thinned, until it was nothing but air again. She hadn't told him her name. She hadn't needed to. And when the orchard went quiet once more, it felt different, not empty, but marked, like something had passed through, left a handprint on the air, and maybe on him. The sky hung low over the valley, bruised and swollen, the kind of color that promised rain but never followed through. Clouds moved like bruises across the sun, casting long, slow-moving shadows through the orchard. Caleb stood at the edge of the barn, a broken ladder leaning against the frame like it had given up halfway through a job. He squinted up at the roof line, then down at the busted rung in his hands. Splintered clean through, one nail rusted, the other sheared at the head. He could have bought a new one, maybe, if the money was there. But the money wasn't anywhere. So he did what he always did, made do. A hammer hung from his belt, tapping gently against his leg as he moved to the workbench, grabbing a spare piece of pine from a stack left over from last year's repairs. He measured it by eye, didn't bother with chalk. The cut was rough, but it fit. He worked without talking, without music, without distraction, just the creak of wood under his boots and the occasional whisper of wind through the orchard. Even the birds were quiet today. The trees stood still, brittle and bare in places, branches reaching out in that tired way they did when they'd already given everything. A few late apples clung stubbornly near the tops, too high to bother with, too few to matter. He hammered the new rung into place, each strike louder than it needed to be, echoing through the field like he was daring the sky to finally break open. It didn't. He leaned back and looked upward. The clouds pulsed with blue-gray tension. The smell of rain teased at the edges of the air, ozone and earth, that sweet, sharp scent of maybe. But nothing came. The wind rose, tugged at his shirt, and passed. Caleb set the ladder upright, tested the weight with his foot. It held, barely. Good enough. He glanced back at the orchard. Rows of trees stood like soldiers too long at war, scarred, upright, not yet fallen. And maybe that was something. Maybe that was everything. Still standing, even if nothing changed. Even if the rain never came. The stack on the kitchen table had grown thick and uneven, envelopes slumped into one another like exhausted men in line for judgment. Caleb didn't open them anymore. He knew what they said, knew the tone behind the printed words. Urgent, final notice, action required. They'd become a kind of background noise, silent, but screaming. He brushed them aside with the back of his hand, careful not to knock over the jar of cinnamon sticks or the bowl of softening apples. They landed against the salt shaker, fanned out like a losing hand in a game he never meant to play. He lit the lantern instead, the old one with the dented base and cloudy glass. The kitchen filled with soft amber light, shadows stretching across the peeling linoleum like they were trying to escape too. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, but no rain came, not even the false promise of it tonight. Just dry air and the groan of a house that had seen too much standing still. He peeled the apples slow, turning each one in his hand like it deserved better than this. They were bruised in places, some beginning to give with rot, but he salvaged what he could. That was the way of it. Cut out what's bad, keep what's still sweet. The knife moved in steady strokes, rhythm like breathing. The pot on the stove steamed gently, the sugar and spices thickening, turning the scent of the kitchen into something almost bearable, almost warm. Preserves didn't solve anything. They didn't pay mortgages or mend roofs or keep land from slipping through your fingers. But they filled jars. They kept. And sometimes, in the middle of a month with too many endings, that was enough. He ladled the mixture in carefully, wiping the rims, sealing each lid with more reverence than he gave his own name these days. The pop of the seals felt like small victories, quiet affirmations that not everything had gone to waste. He glanced at the pile of mail again, now half-lit and harmless, still unopened, still waiting. But for now, the jars glowed in the lamplight like bottled gold. And Caleb let himself believe for just a moment that something he made might last. The bark came sharp and sudden, cutting through the stillness like a warning. Caleb jolted upright in the barn's loft, where he'd been sorting through a box of rusted hinges and frayed rope he didn't remember keeping. He paused, holding his breath, waiting for the second bark. It came, lower this time, drawn out, the kind of sound a dog makes when it isn't sure whether to fight or fear. He dropped the hinge, wiped his palms on his jeans, and made his way down the ladder. The boards creaked under his boots. Outside, the wind had picked up, dry and restless. The orchard rustled, leaves whispering secrets to one another in the near dark. Dusk had crept in while he wasn't looking. The dog, Samson, was standing rigid at the edge of the fence line near the main road, hackles raised, tail stiff. The old shepherd hadn't moved that fast in months. Caleb squinted in the direction of his focus, eyes searching the half-light, but saw nothing, just the usual stretch of gravel and weeds, the long strip of road that led to nowhere quickly. He stepped closer, hand low, voice soft. "Easy, boy." Samson didn't flinch, just let out another low growl deep in his throat. Caleb followed his gaze. Nothing, but the nothing felt different. He stood still, listening. Wind. Tree creak, his own breath. And then, maybe a flicker. A shadow at the edge of the trees, too small to be a deer, too tall to be imagined. Gone as soon as it came. Caleb narrowed his eyes. Maybe it was just the light playing tricks. Maybe it was his own nerves, wound tight by months of bills and silence. But Samson didn't lie. Not like this. "Come on," Caleb said, giving a soft pat to his thigh. The dog hesitated, then followed, glancing back one last time toward the road. They walked slow toward the house, neither speaking. The porch light buzzed weakly overhead, flickering once before settling. Caleb stood at the top step, turned back, looked into the trees again. Still nothing. But the hair on his arm stayed raised long after the door shut behind him. The bell above the feed store door gave its usual tired jingle as Caleb stepped inside, brushing dust from his sleeves. The place smelled like dry cornmeal, rubber boots, and something faintly medicinal, like all the hope had been preserved in sacks of seed and catalog orders that no one could quite afford. Behind the counter, Eli sat with a ledger cracked open, pencil tucked behind one ear, mouth tight like it always was when business had slowed to a crawl. A couple of ranchers stood by the bins, talking low, the kind of tone that wasn't meant to be secret, but sure wasn't meant to be overheard either. Caleb didn't mean to listen, not at first. "Some woman was in here yesterday," one of them muttered, "asking about that old orchard past the ridge." "Caleb's place?" the other said. Caleb stilled by the shelves of mineral tubs, hand frozen on a 50-pound bag of feed he didn't need, but would carry just to look like he belonged. Said she was looking for the owner, wouldn't give a name, just asked a few questions and left. Had city plates. What did she want? Didn't say, but she sure wasn't lost. Eli glanced up from the counter, saw Caleb, and gave the barest nod, acknowledgement, nothing more. Caleb nodded back, lifted the sack to his shoulder, and moved to the register like he hadn't just heard his life be reintroduced to the public. "Need a receipt?" Eli asked. "Nope." The pencil scratched the total on a notepad. Caleb slid a few bills across the counter, the kind that made his stomach clench. He walked out without a word. Back in the truck, he sat for a beat too long, the feed sack beside him, still sealed. He looked down the road toward the orchard, toward the silence, toward the nothing that had been steady, if not kind. Someone had asked about him, but no one had come knocking. The dust stirred in the wind as he turned the key and pulled back onto the road. He didn't look in the rearview mirror. Didn't have to. Whatever it was, it would find him if it wanted to. Everything else always did. The car didn't belong. That was the first thing Caleb noticed. Sleek, black, low to the ground, and too quiet for the kind of land it now rolled across. It moved like it knew it didn't have to ask permission. Dust kicked up behind it, settling soft and slow over the rows of brittle grass as it pulled up near the porch. The engine cut with a whisper. Caleb stood by the barn, wrench in hand, halfway through trying to coax life out of a generator that had coughed its last decent breath 3 winters ago. He wiped his hands on his jeans, eyes fixed on the car like it might vanish if he blinked. But it didn't. The driver's door opened. A man stepped out. Suit pressed, shoes polished, not a speck of road on him. He looked like something cut from a magazine ad about trust funds and lake houses. The kind of man who didn't belong this far from a city, this far from anything clean or controlled. "Mr. Pierce?" the man asked, tone clipped but respectful, like he'd been coached on how not to sound condescending. Caleb didn't answer right away, just nodded once, the way men do when they're not sure if the ground under their feet has just shifted. The man stepped closer, a leather folio tucked under his arm. "My name's Mitchell. I represent a client who wishes to remain anonymous. They've asked me to deliver a few documents." Caleb felt something crawl behind his ribs. What kind of documents? Mitchell opened the folio with careful fingers, as if what was inside might dissolve under rough handling. Property assessments, a cleared lien notice, a provisional agreement for cooperative ownership, should you choose to accept. He held out the papers like a peace offering or a trap. Caleb didn't take them. "I'm not selling," he said, voice low. "You're not being asked to," Mitchell replied, "just to keep something alive. The orchard, with help." Caleb looked past him, to the rows of trees now cast in long evening light. Still, quiet, watching. "And your client?" Mitchell paused, a slight smile at the corners of his mouth. "Said you'd recognize her when it matters." The wind picked up. The dust swirled between them, and something in Caleb's chest tightened, because part of him already did. The envelope sat heavy on the kitchen table, thicker than anything else that had crossed the threshold in months. Caleb stared at it like it might explode if opened wrong. The lawyer had left just after sunset, his shoes untouched by mud, his answers tidy and rehearsed. Now the kitchen was quiet again, save for the creak of the house settling and the hum of the old fridge that should have quit years ago, but, like him, just kept going. He opened the envelope. Inside, everything was too clean. Legal pages clipped neatly, each one stamped and initialed. No flashy language, no red tape buried in the margins. Just facts. The mortgage, cleared. Paid in full by someone who hadn't left a name. The deed, now listing 2 parties. One, Caleb Pierce. The other, a placeholder name held under privacy protections, signed in the kind of looping signature that looked familiar even though he couldn't quite place it. And then the proposal. It wasn't flashy, just typed bullet points and a single-page letter. A fund, set up to repair the barn, replant new trees, revive the land. A season's worth of support and then some. Enough to give the orchard a chance, not a crutch. His name stayed first on the documents. No demand for control, just a quiet line at the bottom. "You decide how this grows." He rubbed his hand over his face, calloused fingers dragging across 3 days of stubble. The last time he'd seen a deed was in the bank's office, under the shadow of foreclosure. That one had felt like a death notice. This one felt like a dare. No strings. But he didn't believe in no strings. He stood up, paced once, twice, looked out the window. The orchard was wrapped in blue dusk, the trees nothing but silhouettes, their branches bare but not broken. The air outside had that heavy kind of calm, like something was about to start, or something had just ended and no one had noticed yet. He sat back down, read it all again, slower this time. When he reached the end, he didn't sign, but he didn't tear it up either. He just set his hand flat on the page and left it there. The pen scratched across the paper slower than it needed to. Caleb's name, once fluid from years of muscle memory signing checks that bounced and receipts that didn't matter, took longer to land on the bottom line this time. When he finished the stroke, he didn't lean back, just stared at the signature. It looked smaller than he remembered, like even his name had been worn thin from everything it had carried. The banker, this one younger, less rehearsed, tapped a few keys, nodded once, and slid the confirmation across the desk. "It's cleared," he said. "No ceremony, no congratulations. Just fact." Caleb nodded, took the paper, and walked out with the quiet dignity of a man who wasn't sure if he'd just salvaged a life or sold the last piece of it. The check had hit the account 2 days earlier, cleared in full without fanfare, paid from a trust with no name, only a string of numbers and a sealed return address. He didn't ask. He didn't have to. Back at the orchard, the wind carried a different kind of weight. It smelled like cold apples, drying grass, and something else, like old paint cracking under sunlight. Autumn was always sharp around the edges here, but this year it bit a little deeper, maybe because it hadn't broken him. Not yet. He used the money the way he knew how, carefully, with a reverence that bordered on guilt. A new chainsaw, a replacement for the busted irrigation pump, a box of screws instead of digging through the rusted coffee tin under the sink. Then the paint. He hadn't meant to buy it, wasn't on the list. But he passed the aisle in the hardware store and stopped dead when he saw the shade. Not quite red, not quite rust. The exact color the shed had been when his father first built it, when the orchard had just been rows of saplings and borrowed time. He brushed the first coat on just after sunrise, the bristles stiff with newness. The shed drank it in like it remembered. The door creaked when he pulled it open, but it held. Like the orchard, like him. For the first time in too long, he let himself believe this season might end differently. The lawyer came back 2 days later, unannounced, the same quiet tires and that same spotless car easing down Caleb's drive like it belonged. Caleb was out by the back fence, repairing a section the wind had knocked loose. Nothing major, just another task that waited until it couldn't be ignored. He didn't stop working when the car pulled up. Just glanced once, then went back to hammering in a brace. The man stepped out, suit still perfect, clipboard in hand, like the dirt couldn't touch him. "You didn't need to come all the way out here again," Caleb said, keeping his voice even. The man shrugged, calm as ever. "Just tying up loose ends. Final confirmations on the fund transfer. Routine stuff." "Right," Caleb muttered. He set the hammer down and turned fully, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his arm. "You said your client wanted to stay anonymous. Still true?" The lawyer gave the faintest nod. "She's not interested in recognition. Said she didn't want it to feel like a transaction." Caleb narrowed his eyes. "So, it's a woman." The lawyer smiled faintly, as if realizing he'd said more than he meant to. "You didn't ask before." "I'm asking now." He hesitated, looked down at his clipboard like the name might be hiding there, waiting to be slipped loose. But instead of an answer, he said, "She told me you'd know. When it mattered." Caleb stared at him, jaw set, the wind picking up just enough to rattle the loose gate behind him. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I was given." There was a pause, long enough for a crow to call once from the orchard and for the wind to die again. The lawyer tucked the clipboard under his arm. "She didn't want thanks," he added. "Said the kindness had already been returned." Caleb's breath caught a little. 2 apples, no questions. He turned back toward the fence, picked up the hammer again, and didn't watch the car leave. But long after the dust settled, he stood there staring at the orchard like it might offer a face in the trees. Because he did know, he just wasn't ready to say her name yet. The mornings came colder now, not with frost, but with that brittle kind of air that stung when it touched your neck, crept under your sleeves, and reminded you that winter still lingered, even if the calendar said otherwise. Caleb pulled on his gloves with fingers already stiff and stepped into the orchard, before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. The trees stood bare, skeletal silhouettes against a pale sky, their branches stretched outward like they were still asking for something that hadn't come. No buds, no signs of bloom, just wood and memory. But the ground was different. He could feel it in the way his boots pressed down, and the soil didn't crack beneath him. It gave, soft, loose, the kind of give that meant something had shifted underneath. He knelt, pushed back a layer of dry leaves, and scooped up a handful of earth. Darker than it had been in years, damp even. A deep, loamy kind of rich that hadn't been there the season before. It didn't make sense. He hadn't done anything that different, but maybe someone else had. The fund had gone farther than he expected. The irrigation lines he'd repaired held through the cold snap. The fertilizer came on time this year. The new tools made the work smoother, quieter. Even the damn wheelbarrow didn't squeal anymore. Still, every time he passed a tree, he looked for signs that hadn't yet come. A swell in the branch, a shift in color, the promise of bloom. Nothing, just silence. He kept going anyway, pruned where he could, cleared brush, turned soil. It wasn't hope, not exactly. Hope was too fragile a word. This was duty, or maybe defiance. He reached the edge of the orchard, where the land dipped slightly before meeting the low creek bed. A place his father used to say held the best roots, even if it took longer for the trees there to wake. Caleb stood still, looking out across the rows. He could smell the change coming, faint as it was. They hadn't bloomed yet, but the orchard didn't feel dead anymore. It felt patient, like it was waiting for him to keep going. So he did. The mailbox groaned when he pulled it open, the hinge stiff with rust and weather. Caleb didn't check it often anymore. Most of what came through was the same. Coupons he'd never use, final notices he'd already memorized. He flipped through the thin stack, ready to toss the whole thing into the passenger seat of his truck and forget about it again. But then he saw the envelope. No postmark, no stamp, just his name, written in clean black ink across the front, not printed, handwritten, carefully. His hands went still. He glanced down the road, nothing but dust and sky, the orchard behind him sighing in the wind. Whoever left it hadn't waited to be seen. He sat in the truck and opened it there, the door still wide, one boot planted on the dirt. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. No letterhead, no signature, just one line in the same careful script. The apples were perfect. So was your silence. His throat tightened before he knew why. He read it again, then a third time. The note shook slightly in his hand, not from the wind, but from something in him he hadn't named in a long while. It wasn't gratitude, not exactly, not affection either. It was weight, the kind that settled behind your ribs when someone sees a piece of you you thought you'd buried. The apples, she remembered. That day had been small, a quiet thing, but somehow it had stayed with her. Enough to write it down, enough to come back, if not in person, then in this, in ink, no signature, no return address. But he knew. He folded the note slowly and slid it into the glove box, setting it gently beside a tire gauge and a faded receipt from the feed store. When he looked up, the orchard felt different again, not fuller, not blooming, just watched, like someone else had walked those rows, even if only in memory. He turned the key, the engine catching on the second try. As he pulled away, the wind kicked up behind him, sending a few dried leaves dancing across the road. And he let himself wonder just once what it would feel like to be seen and remembered, not for what he'd done, but for what he hadn't said. They came without warning. No calls, no clipboard, no heads up from the lawyer this time. Just a white work truck and a trailer full of gear rattling up the drive one gray morning like they'd always belonged. Caleb watched from the porch, coffee cooling in his hand, boots planted like roots too deep to move. 3 of them stepped out, 2 men, 1 woman, dressed in flannel and canvas, hands already dirty before the day began. They didn't speak much at first, just unloaded equipment like they had a job to do, and no time to waste explaining it. One of the men, older, gave Caleb a small nod as he walked past with a bundle of wrapped saplings balanced on his shoulder. "Orchard's got bones," he said. "Just needs some breath." Caleb didn't answer, didn't ask who'd sent them. He already knew. He walked back inside and returned with the old metal thermoses, 4 of them, scuffed from seasons of forgotten harvests. He filled each with cider, warm and mulled, the kind he used to make when the orchard was something people came to see. He handed them out without a word. The crew nodded in quiet thanks and got to work. Branches cracked softly in the morning stillness as old limbs were trimmed back, rot cut out, dead weight let go. The trees responded slowly, like they weren't sure whether to trust the touch yet. Caleb joined them by midday, gloves on, loppers in hand, sweat clinging to his back despite the cool. No one asked him to help. No one told him what to do. He just found a row and started moving down it, branch by branch, cut by cut. The work was clean, simple, honest. By late afternoon, the orchard looked different, not fixed, still scarred, still struggling, but lighter somehow, cleared, like it could breathe again. They broke for water near the south fence, sitting in the grass, boots muddy, hands stained with bark and soil. No one spoke about who sent the crew or why they'd come. They didn't have to. Help had arrived quietly, without strings, and for the first time in a long while, Caleb didn't feel like he was being rescued. He felt like he was part of something worth saving. The clerk at the county office didn't look up when she slid the folder across the counter. "Most recent title update," she said, her voice clipped, her eyes already back on the screen in front of her. "Filed 2 weeks ago, signed and recorded." Caleb nodded, didn't thank her, just opened the folder slowly, hands still stained from oil and soil. The papers inside smelled faintly of toner and the cold sterility of buildings that had never felt sunlight. A dozen lines of legal phrasing stared back at him, but his eyes went straight to the name. A. Marin. It was there in print, black and simple, like it had always belonged next to his. Not a placeholder anymore, not a mystery filed under someone else's lawyer, just a single initial and a surname, the kind that offered a breadcrumb, but not a trail. He borrowed a pen from the jar at the counter and wrote the name in the corner of the folder. Then, without even thinking, he circled it. Twice. It meant something. Not just the name, but that she'd allowed it, made it real, legal, permanent in a way few things in his life had ever been. He said it under his breath. Marin. The syllables hit soft, like water. Familiar, though he couldn't place why. He flipped through the rest of the documents, searching for more. An address, a first name, a signature. Nothing. Just that. A. Marin. Outside, the courthouse steps felt colder than the air. The sky had gone flat and gray, the kind of overcast that dulled the colors of the world. He sat in his truck for a long minute, folder open on the passenger seat, the name staring up at him like a secret. He tapped his thumb on the leather of the steering wheel, once, twice, again. He didn't know who she was, not really, but she knew him. She'd known the debt, the orchard, the broken ladder, the silence. And still, she signed her name next to his. Whoever she was, she'd written herself into the land. Now he had to figure out if he was ready to read the rest of what she'd started. It started with one tree, the McIntosh near the center, always the first to give, always the first to give up. Caleb spotted it just past dawn, stepping out onto the porch with a mug half full of coffee, and eyes still heavy from the weight of winter. At first he thought it was frost, maybe a trick of morning light catching on tired limbs. But as he stepped into the rows, boots sinking into damp earth, he saw it for what it was. Blossoms. Small, white, fragile-looking things clustered like secrets, like the tree had waited until no one was watching to start breathing again. He touched a branch gently, let it sway under his fingers. The petals quivered, but didn't fall. He looked around. Another tree, then 2 more. By the time he reached the north line, it was clear. It wasn't just the McIntosh. The orchard had bloomed early, unnaturally early. A risk, maybe, but he didn't question it. Not yet. Not as he stood in the middle of those rows, surrounded by white dusted limbs and the faintest scent of new life. The cold was still in the air, but the trees didn't seem to care. They were waking up anyway. For the first time in years, the orchard didn't feel like a graveyard. It felt like a beginning. He stood there for a long time, one hand on a low branch, like someone waiting for a train that finally came after years of watching empty tracks. The kind of moment you don't trust until you hear the whistle. He breathed deep. The scent of blossoms was clean and soft, almost sweet. Not loud, but present, like the land had exhaled after holding its breath too long. He thought of the name in the ledger, thought of the note in his glove box, thought of apples handed over with no questions, and the silence that had stitched them together like a thread too thin to see. Spring had come, not just to the trees, to the space between things, and Caleb stood beneath it, not reaching for anything, just letting it find him. The old sign had hung there so long the paint had flaked down to bare wood. The name was nearly gone, just a ghost of letters burned in by hand decades ago, back when the orchard was young and hope was cheap. Caleb had walked past it 1,000 times, barely noticed it anymore, but today he stopped. The gate creaked as he pulled it open. The wind caught it halfway and slammed it against the post, as if reminding him it still had strength. He stood there a moment, palm pressed to the faded board, thinking about his mother's hands smoothing apple skins in the kitchen, her voice humming low over the crackle of the radio. She'd called the orchard Wind Song when she didn't think anyone was listening, never officially, just quietly. To her it was always alive, never just a plot of land, always something breathing. He found the cedar plank in the shed, the good one he'd saved without reason, smooth and light, but strong enough to hold shape through a few more winters. He sanded it slow, careful. Took his time sketching the letters with chalk first. The curve of the W kept throwing him off, but he didn't rush it. This wasn't the kind of job you did quick. This was the kind you did right. By dusk, he had the word burned in. Wind Song Orchard. He stared at it for a long while. It felt too big and too small at once. Not a business name, not a brand, just something that meant something. He hauled the ladder to the gate himself, balanced the sign with one hand while he drove the screws in with the other. The wind picked up halfway through, sending a low rustle through the trees that sounded, just faintly, like breath. He tightened the last bolt, stepped back, and wiped his palms on his jeans. There it was, not his father's name, not his. Heron. Something soft, something stubborn. He stood in the road a little longer than necessary, looking at the letters catching the last of the sun, and wondered if she'd see it one day, driving slow, window down, heart cracked open just enough to hear the wind sing, and stay. The truck was older than she was, an old Ford with mismatched panels and a rattle in the engine that echoed down the lane before it even reached the gate. Caleb heard it while he was elbow-deep in a busted irrigation valve behind the shed, the sound slicing through the afternoon stillness like a cough in a church. He wiped his hands on a rag as the truck rolled to a stop near the front fence. The woman who stepped out couldn't have been more than 25, maybe younger. Boots unlaced, camera slung around her neck like it was part of her. Her hair was tucked up under a cap, and her eyes swept the orchard like she'd already started composing the place in frames. "You Caleb Pierce?" she called, not shy. "Depends who's asking," he said, squinting into the sun. She smiled, but not wide, just enough. "I'm Ada, photographer. I'm scouting potential retreat sites for a client. She asked me to take a few shots, get a feel for the layout." Caleb's stomach went tight. What client? She looked down, unzipping her pack and pulling out a notepad, flipped a page. "Marin," she said. "First name only, no company listed, just a personal inquiry." The breath caught in his chest. Marin. She hadn't shown up herself. But this was close. A message, maybe, a test. He gestured toward the orchard. "You can shoot what you like. Just avoid the east field. Saplings are new." Ada nodded, already raising the camera to her eye, clicking once, then again. "She said you'd be quiet," she said after a beat. "Said that was part of the draw." Caleb didn't answer, just watched her move through the rows, snapping photos of limbs stretched wide in bloom, of the faded red of the shed door, of the sign he'd carved by hand just days earlier. Windsong Orchard. He stood there with dirt on his hands, boots sunk half an inch into the soil, and realized she was still building something with him, even from a distance, even in silence. The box wasn't supposed to be there. He'd packed it himself, filled with the week's best, wine saps, Jonah Golds, and a few early Fujis that had turned sweet in spite of the cold nights. He'd stacked it neatly among the others on the back of the flatbed, ready for the co-op drop-off in town. But as he unloaded, something shifted. One of the boxes tilted slightly, heavier than it should have been. Not by much. Just enough to feel wrong in his hands. He set it down on the tailgate, peeled back the lid, and moved the top layer of apples aside. There it was. A small envelope, cream-colored, soft-edged, folded once. No stamp, no address, just his name, written in handwriting he didn't recognize, but felt like it knew him anyway. He glanced around the lot. Empty, save for the rusted vending machine humming under the overhang and the echo of his own breath. He slipped the envelope into his jacket pocket, heart thudding in a slow, uncertain rhythm. He didn't read it until hours later, when the sun was leaning west, and the orchard was wrapped in that quiet glow that made everything look more honest than it was. He sat on the porch, boots unlaced, the smell of apples clinging to his skin, pulled the letter from his pocket, opened it. The paper was thin, the words were not. "I bought the orchard so you wouldn't have to lose something beautiful just to survive. That's all it ever was, a way to keep something worth saving from slipping through your fingers. You don't owe me anything. But you should know, this place doesn't just belong to you anymore. It belongs to anyone who sees it the way I did. Yours if you want it. Shared if you're brave enough. M." He read it twice. A third time, slower. Then folded it again, careful with the crease like it might tear if he breathed too hard. She hadn't signed her full name. She didn't need to. The trees swayed behind him, soft with spring. And for the first time, Caleb let himself lean back and wonder what it would feel like, not just to hold something beautiful, but to let someone hold it with him. He saw the car before he saw her. It was parked under the wine sap, the oldest tree on the property, the one that still bore fruit with more defiance than grace. The car wasn't the sedan from before. This one was newer, sleek but not flashy. Dust already clinging to the tires, as if it had meant to find gravel, not pavement. Caleb stood on the porch, one hand resting on the railing, the other gripping the mug he hadn't touched in 20 minutes. The air was still, late afternoon sun catching on the edges of the branches, and everything in him said not to move. Just watch. Wait. Then she stepped out. Boots this time, laced and worn, jeans cuffed at the ankle, a denim jacket pulled tight over a cream shirt. Her hair was down, darker than he remembered, but loose and moving in the breeze like it didn't know what it meant to be tamed. She didn't look around, didn't wave, just closed the door gently, turned, and started walking the rows. Caleb didn't call to her, didn't move from the porch. He just watched as she stepped between the trees like she'd done it 100 times, though she hadn't. Not really, not in the open, not like this. She ran her hand along one of the lower branches, slow and light, fingers brushing new leaves like she was listening through her skin. Her posture was different now, upright, measured, not the woman who'd asked for directions barefoot and cracked around the edges. There was no flinch in her shoulders, no apology in her steps. But it was her, and he felt it like a pull under the ribs. She walked the length of the middle row, then turned toward the shed, stopped by the new sign on the gate. Her fingers hovered just above the carved letters. Windsong Orchard. She smiled just barely, then kept going, like she didn't want to claim credit, like she didn't need to. Still, she didn't speak. And neither did he. But some silences aren't empty. Some are just waiting to be filled. He was fixing the latch on the barn door when he heard her footsteps, soft, deliberate, boots on gravel. Caleb didn't turn around right away, just kept his eyes on the rusted hinge, twisting the screwdriver with more force than necessary, like if he focused hard enough on the stubborn metal, he wouldn't have to face the storm he felt gathering behind him. She stopped a few feet away, close enough that he could hear her breathing, slow and steady. "I didn't think I'd make it back," she said. He turned then. She stood with one hand tucked into her jacket pocket, the other holding an apple, red, streaked with gold, plucked from the same wine-sap tree he'd once reached for without thinking, handed to her with no questions and no expectations. "You did," he said. Her eyes searched his face like she was trying to measure time in the lines that hadn't been there before. He didn't smile, but he didn't look away. She stepped forward and held out the apple. "This one felt like it belonged to you," she said, "but I wanted to give it back." He looked at it for a moment, then took it. The skin was cool against his palm, still damp with morning. He didn't bite into it, just held it, the same way he'd held her silence once, like it mattered more than it should have. "You didn't have to," he said, voice low. "I know," she replied. "That's why I did." They stood like that for a long moment, the barn casting a long shadow behind them, the orchard just beyond, full and breathing in the late light. "I almost didn't come back," she said. "Thought maybe I'd already asked too much by leaving what I left." "You didn't ask anything," he said. "I should have." He didn't argue. He didn't have to. Instead, he stepped aside, just slightly, and nodded toward the open barn door. "Not much to see," he said. She smiled then, small, quiet, but there. "I'm not here to see what's finished." And this time, she didn't leave. She stayed. The table was nothing more than 2 sawhorses and a plank of cedar, warped slightly from age. Caleb had found it behind the shed, sanded it down enough that no one would get a splinter, and dragged it out under the wine-sap tree just before the light began to soften. He set out 2 plates, one mismatched fork and knife apiece, and a mason jar of wildflowers she hadn't asked for, but noticed anyway. She arrived with a small casserole dish wrapped in a towel and a bottle of something red. He hadn't seen her in anything but denim and flannel, but tonight she wore a simple blouse, sleeves rolled to the elbows, collar open just enough to let the breeze in. Her hair was half-tied, like she'd started to dress up, then stopped herself. They ate slow. The sun dipped behind the ridge as the shadows grew long and soft, dappling through the leaves above them. The scent of earth and apple wood lingered in the air, the orchard around them humming its quiet evening song, wind in branches, insects singing low, the rustle of something small moving through tall grass. She didn't speak right away, just ate a few bites, then set her fork down and looked out at the rows. "I used to have an office with glass walls," she said finally, "top floor. You could see the river from one side, the skyline from the other." Caleb didn't say anything, he just watched her. "People used to call me ma'am and Ms. Marin like I had all the answers," she said, voice low. "And for a while I liked it, liked feeling important, useful, necessary." She looked down at her plate. "Then one day I looked up and realized I hadn't tasted anything real in years, not food, not people, not even my own thoughts." Caleb nodded once, slow. "So you left." "I walked out at lunch and never went back," she said. "I think they're still waiting for me to return the keycard." He smiled, just barely. She saw it. And for a while they just listened to the orchard breathe. "You still feel important here?" he asked. She turned toward him, eyes steady. "I don't need to." And that was enough. The fire crackled between them, small and steady, built from orchard scraps and wind-fallen limbs. It was late, the kind of late that wrapped around the bones and asked hard questions. The stars were clear, scattered wide over the rows, like they'd been watching from the start. Caleb sat on an overturned crate, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold, staring into the flames like they owed him an answer. She sat cross-legged across from him, jacket draped around her shoulders, eyes soft in the firelight. "I almost sold it," he said. She didn't speak, just waited. He ran his thumb along the rim of the mug. "Last winter, before any of this. The bank was circling, and I thought, hell, maybe someone else could love it better, or maybe no one needed to." "But you didn't." He shook his head. "Didn't know why at the time. Pride, maybe. Stubbornness. Habit." She leaned forward, elbows resting on her knees. "It wasn't pride." He looked up at her then, brow creased. "It was grief," she said. "You were still holding the pieces. Didn't know if putting them down would mean forgetting." The wind moved through the orchard, soft but steady. He looked past her, toward the trees. Their branches reached high and bare, blossoms long gone now, fruit not yet formed, still waiting. "I didn't think anything was left," he said. "I'd walk through here some mornings and feel like the only thing breathing was me, and even that didn't feel certain." She reached down and picked up a fallen twig, twirling it between her fingers. "I saw you once," she said, "the first time I was here, before I even spoke to you." He tilted his head. "You were just standing there, by the broken fence, looking at a tree that looked half dead, but you didn't look defeated. You looked like someone who still showed up, even when it stopped showing up for you." He swallowed hard. The mug in his hands felt heavier than it was. "You can't measure everything in yield," she added. "Not everything that grows is meant to be counted." He didn't reply. He didn't need to. The fire crackled, the orchard listened, and somewhere deep in the roots, something small shifted toward bloom. It began just after dawn, when the sky turned the color of old pewter and the wind shifted from dry to damp. Caleb was in the lower grove, checking the new saplings, his hands wrapped around the slender trunk of a honeycrisp, barely taller than his waist. He didn't notice it at first, just a shift in the way the birds stopped singing, the way the leaves stopped rustling like they, too, were waiting. Then the rain came, software measured, the kind of rain that didn't threaten, didn't take, it gave. Droplets fell in slow rhythm, landing with gentle taps on the canvas of his jacket, the brim of his hat, the tilled earth beneath his boots. He stood still, hands loose at his sides, and let it happen. No flash, no thunder, just water. The soil drank it in like something long starved. It darkened, rich and loamy, pulling the moisture down toward the roots like a held breath, finally exhaled. Caleb crouched low, ran his fingers through the damp dirt, and felt the difference instantly. Cool, alive, not soaked, just full. The orchard sighed. Branches, still bare from the long, hesitant spring, reached higher, leaves trembling beneath the gentle weight of the weather. Puddles formed in the dips of the land, slow and silver, not rushing to fill, but content to gather. The roof of the barn pinged softly with each drop, and the air filled with the scent of apple bark, wet earth, and the faint tang of rust. He walked the rows without speaking, letting the rain bead on his shoulders, trail down the back of his neck. His jeans soaked through at the knees. He didn't care. He hadn't seen a rain like this in months, maybe years. Not the angry kind that tore through and left more damage than relief, but the kind that stayed long enough to change things. By the time he made it to the signpost at the front gate, she was standing there. No umbrella, no coat. Just a quiet smile and rain-tracing lines down her face like the orchard had welcomed her, too. Neither spoke. There was no need. Some storms arrived to take. This one came to give. The hole was already half dug when she arrived, the spade buried in soft earth and Caleb on one knee, sweat at the base of his neck, shirt clinging damp to his back. The morning sun hadn't burned through the mist yet, and the orchard around them was hushed, the kind of quiet that doesn't ask for words. She didn't speak right away, just knelt beside him, brushed her hand along the edge of the hole, fingers pressing into the soil like she needed to feel its weight. Caleb glanced at her, then back at the sapling lying nearby, peach, thin and hopeful, roots bundled in burlap and damp moss. They worked without instruction. He steadied the base. She cradled the roots. He lowered it into place, and together they began to pack the dirt back around it, hands brushing, knuckles grazing. A rhythm found them, quiet, sure, shared. When it stood upright, awkward, a little off-center but anchored, they stepped back. "Looks good," he said. She nodded, wiping a streak of soil from her wrist. Her cheeks were pink, hair curling at the edges where the morning's damp had claimed it. Then, without looking at him, she whispered, "Juniper?" He blinked. "What?" "The tree," she said. "I'm calling her Juniper." He looked at her then, really looked. Her eyes didn't waver, though something in them shimmered, not with uncertainty, but memory. She didn't offer more, no story, no reason, just the name, settled between them like a seed dropped gently into soil. He nodded once, didn't ask, didn't need to. Some things grow without explanation. They stood there for a long moment, watching the tree sway slightly in the breeze, fragile but upright. Around them the orchard stretched wide, bloomed and breathing, a living thing again. Caleb looked down at his hands, still dirty, then up at the woman beside him. Her fingers were caked with earth, but she held them gently at her sides, as if ready to reach out or let go, depending on what the next moment asked. This wasn't about one season. It never had been. It was about staying, about starting, about planting something with no promise but presence, and letting it take root anyway.